After the fighting at Quatre Bras, the two opposing commanders Marshal Ney and the Duke of Wellington initially held the ground while they obtained information about what had happened at the larger Battle of Ligny. When they received intelligence that the Prussian army under the command of Prince Blücher had been defeated by the French army of the North under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte. Upon receiving this news, Wellington organized the retreat of the Anglo-allied army to a place he had identified a year before as the best place in Belgium for him to be able to employ his reverse slope tactics when fighting a major battle, the escapement close to the village of Waterloo, aided by thunderstorms and torrential rain. Wellington's army successfully extricated itself from Quatre Bras and passed through the defile of Genappe. The infantry marched ahead and were screened by a large cavalry rearguard. The French harried Wellington's army, but were unable to inflict any substantial casualties before night fell, and Wellington's men were ensconced in bivouacs on the plain of Mont-Saint-Anne. Prelude. After the fighting at Quatre Bras, the two armies settled down for the night. The Anglo-allied army on the field of battle and the French just to the south. The bivouac on the battlefield of Quatre Bras, during the night of the 16th of June, continued undisturbed until about an hour before daylight, when a cavalry patrol, having accidentally got between the adverse pickets near Piermont, caused an alarm in that quarter that was quickly communicated to both armies by a rattling fire of musketry, which, rapidly augmenting, extended itself along the line of the advanced posts. Among the first who hastened to ascertain the origin and nature of the engagement was Picton, who, together with other staff officers, as they arrived in succession on discovering that no advance had been attempted or intended on either side, soon succeeded in restoring confidence. Similar exertions were successfully made on the part of the French officers, and as day began to break upon the scene, both parties resumed the previous tranquility. In this untoward affair, the pickets furnished by the 1st Hanoverian Brigade and by the 3rd Brunswick Light Battalion were sharply engaged, and the pickets of the Field Battalion Bremen suffered considerably. Hussar Brigade at Quatre Bras. It was not long before Wellington, who had slept at Genappe, arrived at Quatre Bras, where he found Major General Sir Hussey Vivian, whose brigade of light cavalry, consisting of the British 10th Hussars, of the British 18th Hussars, and of the 1st Hussars of the King's German Legion, was posted on the left of that point with two strong pickets thrown out, one of the 18th Hussars on the Namur Road, and the other of the 10th Hussars, under Major Frederick Howard, in front, with a picket from the latter, under Lieutenant Arnold, on the right of the Namur Road. Vivian, on being asked what account he could give of the French, communicated to Wellington the result of his observations, which were necessarily very limited, as with the exception of the firing that had taken place, as before mentioned, along the line of pickets, the French had continued perfectly quiet, and had as yet given no indication of any offensive movement. British Hussar patrol sent down the Namur Road. Wellington then took a general survey of the battlefield, and while sweeping the horizon with his telescope, he discovered a French vedette on some rising ground, in the direction of Fleurus, and a little to the right of the high road leading to Namur, apparently belonging to some picket thrown out from Marshal Ney's extreme right on the previous night, after the battle had ceased, or to some detached corps placed in that quarter for the purpose of observation, and for the maintenance of the communication between Napoleon and Ney. Wellington had received no intelligence of Blücher, and probably, judging from the advanced position of the vedette in question, that whatever might have been the result of the Battle of Ligny, the Prussians could not have made any forward movement likely to endanger Ney's right. He came to the conclusion that it was quite possible that, on the other hand, Napoleon might have have crossed the Namur road, and cut off his communication with Blücher, with the design of maneuvering upon his left and rear, and causing him to be simultaneously attacked by Ney. Wellington therefore desired Vivian to send a strong patrol along the Namur road to gain intelligence respecting the Prussian army. A troop of the 10th Hussars, under Captain Gray, was accordingly dispatched on this duty, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel de Hon. Sir Alexander Gordon, one of the Wellington's aides-de-camp. As the patrol advanced along the road, the French vedette began to circle, evidently to give notice of the approach of an enemy, and then retired. This induced the patrol to move forward with great caution, so as to guard against the possibility of being cut off. Nevertheless it continued, but with all due precaution, advancing along the road, until after passing a few scattered cottages, comprising a hamlet called Petit Marbe, it reached, about 2.4 kilometers further on, some rising ground, about 8.0 kilometers from Quatre Bras, and beyond which was another height. A vedette was observed posted upon the latter, but who had evidently not yet noticed the approach of Captain Gray's troop. Down in the intervening hollow was an isolated house, at the door of which stood a dismounted sentry, and some horses were standing in an adjoining yard. Captain Gray directed Lieutenant Bacon to patrol towards the house, while he remained with the remainder of the troop, concealed from the French, a disposition favored by the nature of the ground, and the trees in the hedges, on both sides of the road. When Lieutenant Bacon's party moved forward, it was discovered by the vedette, who began circling, and fired his carbine. The French pocket posted in the house instantly rushed out. Several of the men had their jackets and accoutrements off, and the post could easily have been captured, had the special duty on which the British patrol was engaged admitted of an attack. The French turned out very quickly and galloped to the rear along the high road, while Bacon's party was recalled. A few French cavalry galloped up to the vedette on the heights, but evinced no disposition to advance. British patrol finds the Prussians at Tilly. It had now become sufficiently evident that, commencing from this point, that the French were in possession of the Namur road, but the principal object which Sir Alexander Gordon had in view was yet to be attained. The patrol now retired a little until it reached a cross-road, which a peasant pointed out as the Prussian line of retreat. Pursuing this track, the patrol, within an hour, reached Dilly, where General Zieten, who had been placed in temporary command of the Prussian cavalry, was covering the retreat of the Prussian army. After remaining there about a quarter of an hour, during which Sir Alexander Gordon obtained from General Zieten the most ample information respecting the movements of the Prussians, the patrol commenced its return at a quick pace, striking into a cross-road, which joined the high road at a point nearer to Quatre Bras than the one whence it had left it. The patrol reached Quatre Bras at 7:30, and Sir Alexander Gordon immediately reported to Wellington that the Prussians had retreated towards Wavre, that the French occupied the ground on which the Battle of Ligny had been fought, but that they had not crossed the high road, along which the patrol had proceeded almost into the immediate vicinity of their advanced posts. Wellington's orders a retreat and informs Blücher of his plans. Napoleon's lack of movement was very notable, and served to satisfy Wellington that either Napoleon's victory had not been followed up with a vigor by which the safety of his own army would have been imperiled, or that the victory had not been of a character sufficiently decisive to have enabled the Napoleon to avail himself of such an advantage. Having ascertained that the contingency for which he was fully prepared had actually taken place, Wellington decided upon retreating along the Brussels road until he reached a position in front of the point of junction of the roads leading from Charleroi and Nivelles-upon Brussels, the Mont Saint-Jean escarpment near the village of Waterloo. On this position he might rely upon the aid of a sufficient portion of Blücher's forces from Wavre, which combined with his own would enable the coalition to confront Napoleon and his main army with a numerical superiority at a decisive point. Wellington was familiar with the topography of the position, having identified it as a possible battle site a year previously while surveying the territory around Brussels. Shortly after the departure of the patrol of the 10th Hussars along the Namur road, Wellington received some dispatches from England, to which he gave his attention, and now that he had satisfied himself as to the real state of things, he issued his orders for the movements of his distant units, the 2nd Division of British Infantry, to march from Nivelles to Waterloo at 10 o'clock. The brigades of the 4th Division at Nivelles were to march on Waterloo at 10 o'clock. The brigades of the 4th Division at Braine-le-Comte, and on the road from Braine-le-Comte to Nivelles, to collect and halt at Braine-le-Comte. All the baggage on the road from Braine-le-Comte to Nivelles was to return immediately to Braine-le-Comte, and to proceed from the to Halle and Brussels. The spare musket ammunition was to be immediately parked behind Genappe. The corps under the command of Frederick, Prince of Orange, was to move from Angouin on that evening of the 17th of June, and take up a position in front of Halle, occupying Braine-le-Château with 2 battalions. Colonel Estorff was to fall back with his brigade on Halle, and place himself under the orders of Prince Frederick. Having issued order for those units present on the battlefield and in the vicinity were to retreat, Wellington lay down on the ground near Quatre Bras, covered his head with one of the newspapers he had been reading, and appeared to fall asleep. After remaining some time in this state, he again rose, mounted his horse, and rode a little distance down the battlefield in front of Quatre Bras. He then looked about through his telescope, and expressed to those about him his astonishment at the perfect stillness of the French, remarking at the same time, "What if they should be also retiring? It is not at all impossible." A second officer, Lieutenant Massow, had been dispatched from the Prussian to the Anglo-allied headquarters, and it was about this time that he reached Wellington. He informed Wellington of the Prussian retreat upon Wavre, and the position Blücher intended to be assumed in that quarter. It was of a nature which, taken altogether, was so far satisfactory, that Wellington immediately asked Lieutenant Massow to inform Blücher that he intended to retreat and take up a position south of Waterloo, where he proposed to stand and fight, provided Blücher would detach 2 corps to his assistance. The Anglo-allied light troops retire. The following is the manner in which the retreat of the Anglo-allied infantry, then in full operation, was executed. It was an important matter to mask the retreat as much as possible, so as to gain time for the free and unimpeded movement of the army along the high road leading to the position in front of Waterloo. For this purpose, the light troops continued to maintain the line of outposts, until the respective supports, which had remained stationary sufficiently long to conceal the retreat of the troops in the rear, began also to retire. The British 1st and 5th Divisions, and the Dutch-Belgian 2nd Division, and also the Brunswick Corps, effected the retreat in excellent order, notwithstanding the delay that was created by the narrowness of the bridge and street of Genappe. The retreat was covered by the 3rd Division, to which were added for this purpose the 1st Battalion of the British 95th Rifles, the Brunswick Advanced Guard Battalion, and the light companies of British Brigade of Guards. The main body of Alton's division commenced its retreat about 11 o'clock. The 2nd Brigade, King's German Legion, was withdrawn to Sartre-Mauves, which it immediately occupied, as also the wood of Les Censes in its front. The British 5th Brigade then retired secretly until it reached some favourable ground, a little distance in rear of Ompted's brigade, upon which it was immediately drawn up. The 1st Hanoverian Brigade was withdrawn still further to the rear, and occupied a 3rd position. Thus posted, the division was ordered, in the event of being attacked, to retire by brigades alternately. It was a little before midday when the light troops of Alten's division began to retire. They occupied the advanced line, commencing from the southern extremity of the wood of Bossu on the right, extending along Gemiancourt and the enclosures of Piermont, and crossing the Namur road on the left, from which line they gradually and slowly fell back upon Ompted's brigade, in a manner evincing admirable skill, steadiness, and regularity, in order more effectually to mask the movements on the Allied side of the Namur road. The whole of the cavalry was drawn up in 2 lines immediately contiguous to, and in rear of, that road, the heavy cavalry forming the 2nd line, and pickets being thrown out from the 1st line, to relieve those of the retiring infantry. The main body of Alten's division now commenced its further retreat, but not by alternate brigades. This mode having been directed only in the event of an attack, the latter retired successively in the order in which they stood, preserving the relative distances, so that they might commence the alternate system of retreat, if attacked, to facilitate the passage of other portions of the army through the narrow defile of the bridge and town of Genappe. This division retired by Béziers and crossed the Dyle, lower down the stream, by the bridge at Ways, Belgium. Ney's views and dispositions. In the early part of the morning, Marshal Ney had, like his opponent, been ignorant of the result of the Battle of Ligny, but he was aware that the Anglo-allied army had been considerably reinforced during the night, principally by the arrival of its cavalry. Ney calculated that if Napoleon had gained a victory, and crossed the Namur road, the longer Wellington remained in the position of Quatre Bras, the greater the danger he incurred of having not only his communication with Blücher effectually cut off, but also his main line of retreat upon Brussels intercepted, and that in such a case it was wiser not to advance against the British general, as the latter might then retire, and thus elude the effect of a combined operation between Napoleon's and his own forces. Ney also judged that if, on the other hand, the French Emperor had been defeated, an attack made on his own part, upon the Anglo-allied army, might subject himself to the risk of having to contend against a combined operation between Wellington and Blücher, and thus expose both his own and Napoleon's forces to the probability of being defeated in detail. In this uncertainty, Ney sent a message by General Count Flavout, who happened to be still with him, and who was returning to rejoin Napoleon wherever he might be found, expressive of his anxiety to learn the result of the action of the preceding day. In the meantime, he kept his troops in a state of perfect quietude. His main body was posted in reserve on the heights of Fran, between which and the outposts there were intermediate columns of support, but no movement whatever was attempted. Advances by Napoleon and Ney. Ney at length received the information he had solicited, in a dispatch from Marshal Soult, wherein the result of the Battle of Ligny was briefly described. It also stated that Napoleon was proceeding, with the principal portion of his forces, to the mill of Brie, close to which the high road leads from Namur to Quatre Bras, and that therefore it would not be practicable for the Anglo-allied army to act against him, but that, should such a case happen, the Emperor would march directly upon it by that road, while Ney should attack it in front, and in this manner that army would at once be destroyed. The dispatch required from Ney a report of the exact position of his forces, and an account of all that was going on in his front. Hence it is evident that Ney's opinion, that a victory at Ligny ought to be followed up by a combined attack upon Wellington, perfectly coincided with Napoleon's views. The military historian William Siborne states that while Ney was thus justified in remaining inactive during the early part of the day, the fact of Napoleon's not moving directly upon Genappe with the morning's dawn, and his excessive delay in breaking up his bivouac at Ligny, are inexplicable. A glorious opportunity had presented itself for the attainment of his original design of defeating both armies in detail, but which was completely lost by a most extraordinary and fatal want of energy and vigor in seizing upon the advantages which the victory of Ligny had placed within his reach. Ney, having ascertained that Napoleon's forces were in motion, had commenced the advance of his own troops, when a second dispatch reached him, dated "in front of Ligny at noon," intimating that Napoleon had just posted a corps of infantry and the Imperial Guard in advance of Marbe, that he wished him to attack the Anglo-allied army at Quatre Bras, and force Wellington from his position, and that his operations would be seconded by the corps at Marbe, to which point Napoleon was proceeding in person. Upon discovering that the Anglo-allied infantry had retired, and that the troops around and in rear of Quatre Bras consisted of cavalry covering the retreat, Ney brought forward his own cavalry in advance, and appeared to regulate its movements so that its attack might be directed against the front of the British simultaneously with that of the cavalry which he now perceived advancing along the Namur road against its flank. About this time, the 10th Hussars were moved across the Namur road, and down the slope in front where they were halted, in echelon of squadrons, and while they were thus posted, Wellington and his staff came to the front of the regiment. For this spot Wellington was attentively watching, through his telescope, the dispositions and movements of the French, whom he could discover as soon as they reached the Quatre Bras side of Little Marbe, when all at once at a distance of about 3.2 kilometers, masses were seen forming on the side of the Namur road, conspicuously glittering in the sun's rays, by which Wellington was at first induced to believe that they were infantry, whose bayonets were so brilliantly reflected, but it was soon discovered that they were French cuirassiers. After a short time, these were observed to advance, preceded by lancers, and it was not long before the pickets of the 18th Hussars, posted on that road, began skirmishing, as did also the picket of the 10th Hussars, more in the front of the position, and likewise, still further to the right, in front of Quatre Bras, a picket consisting of a squadron of the British 11th Light Dragoons, detached from the 4th Cavalry Brigade. The 10th Hussars then fell back again into the proper place in the line. 6th Cavalry Brigade now took up a new alignment, moving back its left so as to present a front to the advancing French, and to protect the left of the position. The Vandeleurs Brigade was then in right rear of Vivian's and close to Quatre Bras.